What's cracking, guys? VenomousStare back with Beginner's Basics, a series where I take a look at the basic concepts of StarCraft 2 for the people who, quite frankly, just installed the game. I mean, we're going to be jumping into some very simple topics, but we're also going to be covering things that could help a more advanced player. I've already made a Zerg guide for Beginner's Basics, so if you're interested in that, link will be in the description. Today's guide is going to be focused on Terran, specifically Terran versus Protoss, and an extremely easy build order that you can do that can really help you gain ladder points, not just because you're winning, but because you're getting an opportunity to micro your units and really practice with playing around with them, but you're also taking an expansion behind it. So this means that you don't have to try to hold on to an early game expansion, and it means that you don't have to do a lot of scouting. Now I know scouting is very important and it's something that you should aim to do in general in StarCraft, but I know that a lot of times scouting can be difficult for new players because they have to remember to do it, and most importantly, they don't really know the tech trees of the races, so even if they scout their opponent, they don't really understand what they are seeing or what they need to be looking for per se. So this build order that I'm going to be showing you with Terran is very, very safe early. It dies to almost nothing. And it also gives you the opportunity to be aggressive and practice micro. The very first, most important part of this build order is a quick wall off. Now, if you're not familiar with the wall off, essentially in StarCraft everyone starts up in a main base. They have their little starting building, 2 geysers and minerals, and they have what's called their main ramp. Usually the only way to get into the main base on a map is this one ramp. So building 2 depots and a barracks at the top of the ramp means that your opponent can't get in and scout you. Now scouting obviously sounds like what the word scouting means, you know, seeing what your opponent's doing, retrieving information. But in StarCraft 2, scouting is very important because a lot of times it dictates what reaction you have to do. Now, we can forsake our early game Reaper Scout because we're going to be playing so insanely safe. A lot of players will tell you that the standard build is Reaper Expand, and that's true, but this is not Reaper Expand, this is something different. I find that for new players, Reaper Expand can be really difficult. You're microing a unit in the early game that is very fragile and has a potential to die. You have to constantly flick back to your base to try to macro. And in general, I feel like the new player is better off doing something much more simple like this. Especially, I mean, we're talking fresh players, not like, oh, I'm stuck in Gold League, I've been playing since 2015. The game just went free to play. This video is definitely targeted towards the players who want to learn the game. So after you get your barracks wall off and deny the scout, notice that the probe ran up to the top, couldn't get in. Had to run out to my natural to try to wait to see if I expanded, and then eventually was killed by 1 Marine. Now briefly I need to pause and talk about the importance of denial of scouting. So the fact that the Protoss worker can't get into your main base in the early game is a huge deal. Most importantly, it means that they don't know what you're doing as far as expansion early or aggression early, and that is the most important thing because that heavily dictates how they are going to react and play. But it also means that you, as the new player, don't have to worry about any early game shenanigans. You don't have to worry about a probe hiding gateways or cannons in your main. You don't have to worry about it killing the workers that are trying to build structures. That can be very irritating if you're a new player and you're just struggling to hit your depots and get the structures down at the proper time. If you have a probe going back and forth and harassing the workers building stuff, that can be hard to deal with. So what have I done? I've made a barracks with the reactor and I'm pumping Marines. Now it's important to note that I got 1 Marine before I made the reactor. And then I got a factory with Tech Lab. Of course, I made the factory and then made the Tech Lab. I didn't do any floaty nonsense. And then as soon as the factory was done, I made the starport. A lot of new players might be asking, well, when do you make them? How do I know when to make them? Like, is there a supply or something? Essentially, keeping in mind that you've taken double gas relatively early on, that means that the crux of the issue is you need to make the structure whenever you have the gas. So in this instance, I make the barracks, the 1 Marine, the reactor, and as soon as I have 100 gas within that time frame, I'm making the factory. Essentially, you want it as quickly as possible, and the gas is going to be what bottlenecks you from getting there. Another reason why I think this build is good for new players is because it is very simple what you're doing. We're going to be doing an early game push where you just make 2 Marines at a time out of this barracks. You make tanks as constantly as you can with this factory, and you make a medevac and 2 liberators out of the starport. And after we have those things, we push. If you're having trouble really hitting those things and getting them out in a timely manner, I would say just push when you have the 3 tanks. And then maybe you'll have your Marine Force, your 3 tanks, and a Liberator and a medevac. You run into issues where you don't really have money for everything, and that's normal. The trick is you always want to be making workers up until you get 1 full base of saturation. That's 3 in each gas and 16 mineral workers. This is abnormal. Usually in StarCraft you want to be making workers the entire game, but since we're only on 1 base and we're doing very heavy aggression, we don't really have the money for that. We are going to expand behind this push, and at that point we will start double producing workers again. So don't get in the habit of thinking that, oh yeah, once I get this many workers I stop making workers. No, this is kind of the exception because we're doing a very aggressive build early on. So I have to pause again. My opponent has attempted to scout me twice now, once with the probe, once with the stalker, both of which were thwarted by this wall-in. Now, even if I hadn't made siege tanks, this wall-in would have prevented the stalker from seeing any of this stuff. He would, even if he ran up to the very top of the ramp and took so much damage he died, he only would have been able to see about this much. He would have missed the factory and everything else. So why is this important? Because if we look at my opponent's vision in StarCraft 2, knowing what your opponent's going to be doing is important. What does he know that I'm doing? Nothing. He just sees a barracks. Theoretically, I'm going to just throw out all the different little cutesy things I could be doing. I could have 2 more barracks and a factory. I could be doing a heavy Marine tank push. I could have 4 more barracks with add-ons. I could be doing a very heavy +1 bio push. I could have 2 starports with Tech Lab researching Cloak, doing a Cloaked Banshee rush. I have a ton of options. Now I don't want you to get bogged down or overwhelmed with all of those things. I just want you to know that whenever you limit your opponent's vision, they do have to wonder what you were doing, and there are a lot of different choices. Hell, I could even have an expansion down here, and I could be making it an orbital and then floating it down. Although, you might have seen that already. That's one of those things that might have been shown off already. So with this build, remember, siege tanks, 2 liberators, medevac. Now, one of the most important things in StarCraft 2 is not queuing things up, and what do I mean by that? I mean that in StarCraft 2, you'll be told that you need to spend your money, which is true. Notice that both my minerals and gas here are below 100. This is pretty easy to do whenever you're only on 1 base, is keeping your money low. Keeping your money low is something that becomes more difficult whenever you take expansions. So you do want to keep your money low, and this is called micro, the act of controlling your units in a specific way. Here, the Stalker has taken severe damage, but due to Stalker speed and my lack of stim pack, I am unable to just run him down on the ground. So I've loaded Marines into a medevac, and I have used the boost ability to cover ground, and I'm going to fly ahead of the Stalker with my superior temporary speed, drop Marines all over him to finish him off. This will weaken slightly his defensive forces, if he has 1 less Stalker, but more importantly, it'll prevent the Stalker from doing things like running, staying at this high ground, peeking at my unit, seeing what I have, and then running back. Like I said, limiting vision is important in any RTS game, so here's a little micro trick that you can use to hunt down stray units, where I use the boost to catch up there and drop my Marines off and kill them. Again, let's look at his vision. Doesn't see a lot. He knows that he's being pushed. It's not like he's macroing really poorly. He's trying to tech to storm, but he's spending his money pretty well. He has several gates, so this guy's not terrible or anything. So let's talk about a few other specifics of the build. Remember, it's just very simple. 1 starport, 1 factory, 1 barracks, Marines, tanks, 2 liberators, and a medevac. We've also squeezed in an engineering bay and gotten a turret in our main. This will protect us against things like Stargate openers and Dark Templar. Notice that after we have pushed out and we've reached 400 minerals, an expansion goes down. Now, this is a later expansion than a lot of other builds, and you really are relying on this push doing a lot of damage. However, if we go to units, the Protoss player doesn't really have the tools to deal with this a lot of the times. This is a very tricky unit composition to deal with, because this isn't just mass marine or something that has one specific counter. With Liberator, Siege Tank, Marine, Medevac, it's very tricky to engage for Protoss, because the Siege Tanks and Liberators control zones so well that if you get set up in a good position, you just choke the player out. So with my expansion coming down, the push is about to hit. The Liberator sets up in its ground decimating liberation zone, and we can see here that this is what you want to do. You want to siege one tank in a safe location, and then siege the others in closer locations. Poke with the Marines, and remember that this liberation zone is out. This Liberator is protecting this zone pretty much, because if the Protoss moves, they're going to get eviscerated in this little circle of death, and the Siege Tanks are also going to stack their splash damage. So the trick here is to not lose all your Marines for free, because the Marines are really just a facilitating force to support these moneyed units. So I lost one Marine there, but pressing up kept his army back and allowed these two tanks to get siege. And he throws down force fields here because he knows that if I run in here and kill this pylon, it will depower his robo. He desperately needs immortals. And of course he's worried that if I run in here, he's just going to die outright. Force field is another thing that it's an ability that you use that is micro based. So here he zoned my army away. Theoretically, he could have maybe cut it in half a little, but with this few Marines, it's hard to get perfect force fields. So he throws up some force fields, but he can't really do anything because of the zone control. With Liberators and tanks here, it means that this whole area pretty much can't be walked through. It is important to note that I've really focused on not getting supply blocked, and I am trying to make a tank, a Liberator, and 2 Marines, but whenever you get really focused on microing this attack, sometimes your macro can slip, but it is really important to try to keep a Liberator and a tank coming at all times. So gradually you want to move your siege tanks up, and you always want to have at least one tank siege, because you don't want to be in a position where you unsiege everything at once and the Protoss can move in easily and defend it because you've lost all your splash damage. So here, keep the tanks in a position where they show the low ground expansion, and move the Liberators into a position where they choke off the ramp. Make sure that you have high ground vision of the ramp so you can see stuff coming down. The Terran player is in a great spot here. Essentially, he has units that are incredibly good at zone control, all up in the Protoss player's business. So I went ahead and killed everything the Protoss had over here, so he didn't have any vision of the low ground. And then you want to set up these siege tanks at the base of the low ground, because if they have zealots, they're not going to be able to hit them because they're not in melee range. And the siege tanks are right by this low ground, so they can hit the stuff on the high ground. So pressure here with Marines, move the Liberators up, and remember to fight on your siege tanks. It's also worth noting at home I've gotten another engineering bay and an armory to keep getting upgrades, and I've gotten +1. Move the Liberators up, pressure with the Marines so the Liberators don't die. And at this point, whenever you start pressuring someone's production, you really put them in a scary spot where they have to do something. But there is so much firepower here with Liberator tank that they just can't deal with it. And the Liberators just have such good zone control, and he taps out. I did have this expansion up. I was floating up, my macro slipped a little bit here towards the end. I needed to keep upgrading, throw down 3 more barracks, make a reactor on this, make this an orbital, and start double pumping SCVs. At this point, I had kind of known that I had won, and I was really focused on micro. This is a mistake. You never want to let your macro slip, but it is very important not to lose these moneyed units. If you focus too heavily on macro with this specific build, where you invest everything in your early game into these very gas-heavy tanks and Liberators, you actually do have to focus on not losing them sloppily. If you do a macro-based build like Reaper Expand, you can afford to do more macro focus. Make sure you subscribe for more, it's free.